And joining us now to discuss the issue is Swaran Singh, Professor of International Relations at JNU, India. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me on your program today.
So of all the countries involved which are not participants of the conflict, China's role has been the most controversial. Right now, NATO has emphasized its role as an enabler, which arguably is stepping up the verbal pressure. What do you think is China's agenda here, really? Some say China wants to end the conflict. Others say China actually benefits from the conflict going on, and the attritional warfare depleting the resources of both the West and Russia. So what is your take on that?
I think China definitely is ambitious in terms of emerging as a global player, as a great power, and they have their centennial goals to pursue. And in the choices that they have in reaching to their goals, Russia apparently remains a very alluring partner in future in that sense, given that the Western nations would normally be very, very cautious in facilitating rise of China beyond where China is today in that sense. So given the choices that China has, Russia apparently is a very attractive partner for them, particularly in defense technologies. Also, we are noticing lately in terms of energy supplies, in terms of also creating parallel alternative platforms like BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We also have Russia, India, China trilateral. So China has definitely multiple reasons to feel the necessity to engage Russia as a very close friend. And that's why we saw that just about 2 weeks before Russian forces moved into Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin had visited Beijing and they had signed a joint statement describing their partnership as partnership of no limits. And China is definitely the largest importer of Russian energy now. United States for almost now a year has been talking about China not only sort of enabling Russia in terms of expanding trade and therefore enabling it to contest Western sanctions, but also alleged that China's supplies have also been strengthening military operations of Russia. Chinese, of course, have clearly denied that they have supplied anything in terms of strengthening Russian military. But those kind of insinuations keep coming from Western countries. At this stage, apparently, it doesn't seem that China is in a mood to relent from continuously standing together with Russia. And as I said, it has its own reasons to stand with Russia now.
But the bottom line is that both now Russia and China are tightening their cooperation, and it's tighter than ever, I feel like. Now, looking at this from NATO's perspective, NATO is focusing on strengthening alliances not only within Europe, but also with key partners in the Indo-Pacific region, such as Japan, South Korea, and Australia. So I feel like that this broader coalition aims to counterbalance China's influence. But to your mind, what are the potential risks and benefits of this NATO strategy to engage Indo-Pacific partners in countering China's influence?
Very clearly, I think any organization that begins to grow the way NATO has expanded itself, starting with 12 nations to now reaching 32 and possibly 33 in future, creates its own dissensions. And in your program, you made mention of Orban. You mentioned the president of Turkey. So one notices there are also definitely, on anticipated lines, dissensions within NATO alliance itself. Then, of course, the bigger problem is that the leader of NATO, the United States, is facing its own domestic politics, where, President Donald Trump is likely to return to White House, as the media tells us. And he's very clear. He's not interested in Ukraine war. He's even not interested in sort of climate change debate. He's not interested in even sustaining itself in NATO. In his earlier tenure, he had mentioned repeatedly that burden sharing is something that concerns him a great deal. So NATO has enormous amount of internal challenges, and now, of course, added challenge of standing up to Russia. The United States has remained reluctant in talking about Ukraine joining NATO. So in their recent meeting in Washington, D.C., they spoke of, in principle, yes, Ukraine will be joining, but they have not mentioned any timeline in that. So I think that caution in dealing with Russia and not allowing NATO to get entangled in that kind of a dispute or conflict is something that is very visible in that sense. So NATO has understandably both internal and external challenges which it needs to address, and the election of President of United States will be, I think, very important in giving a certain direction to where NATO wants to go.
So now there is an ongoing discussion about how to or whether to engage with Russia on any meaningful level. And now Western countries have mostly shunned Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. As you've mentioned, China has its reasons. This has caused controversies. Partially also these controversies apply to a recent visit by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Moscow. So also India's relationship with Moscow. And the question which is being raised is why should countries such as India and China, which in the past have suffered because of colonialism by Western countries, engage in a country that very much follows the same pattern today? Like if you look at Russia today, it is like going back to the 19th century and looking at some of the Western countries, which said, you know, morality doesn't matter, there is business to be done, and they were making money at the expense of people in countries which now form the global South, for example. So should we actually take a glance at Russia and say, well, this country is actually making money at the expense of Ukrainians, other countries also which it has been trying to influence forcibly? Where do we draw the line, really?
I think first important idea that I want to underline is to avoid bracketing together several leaders like Orban or Erdogan or Xi Jinping or Modi. Each of these leaders have their own national interests to pursue. They have their own foreign policies, and axis of foreign policy of India has clearly been around strategic autonomy, which means India will not be able to toe any great powers line. And second, of course, also ensuring that it follows multi-alignment, where it talks about building strategic or developmental partnerships in as many sectors with as many countries as possible. And when it comes to Russia, Russia and India have had a very unique relationship starting from late 1950s. They have never had any difficulties in their bilateral relations, unlike China-Russia relationship, where we have seen fluctuations over decades happening. Of course, now China and Russia are really very close. So to understand India's point of view in terms of how India has addressed issue of Ukraine crisis, I think it is important to understand that proactive neutrality of India has been extremely dynamic, and it cannot be simply compared with some of the other leaders that your program has mentioned earlier. India had started all the way back by talking about simply being concerned, and we moved to saying regret. And when there was a massacre in Ukraine in August of 2022, India had called for an international investigation. And of course, gradually, you remember in September of 2022, in Samarkand, talking directly face to face with President Vladimir Putin, Indian Prime Minister had said this era is not era of war. He moved one step ahead last May in Hiroshima G7 summit. And he said that no nation should be allowed to voluntarily change international boundaries. And move now to July, this meeting with President Putin, you heard him say that no peace talks can be anticipated or can become effective in middle of bombing, and he was talking of bombing in Kiev. So India, over a period of time, has been evolving in terms of how it defines strategic autonomy. And my very quick last point on this is that just as India has sought to ensure that two sides begin to talk, and Indian Prime Minister has spoken multiple times on phone to both President Putin and President Zelensky. India hosted Ukrainian Foreign Minister last month in New Delhi. But at the same time, while trying that the dialogue can be a possibility, India has not waited for that talk to begin. And India has supplied humanitarian assistance to people on the ground in Ukraine. And in that sense, India has sought to deal with this problem the way India has leverages, given that it is not really the most influential player. Turkey has been much more successful comparatively in sort of ensuring that two sides begin to talk. And very quick last point, I think the way West and NATO has approached this whole issue also has not been primarily concerned with problems on the ground in Ukraine. They have been looking at it in terms of their contest with Russia as a great power, which is where they are looking at it. And President Biden has been on record to say that he's put a coalition of 50 nations to support Ukraine in their fight against Russia. And recently, the Swiss Peace Summit, for example, did not have Russia sitting in it. So what can best be achieved in a summit like this is to create another diktat for Russia to oblige, which is a non-starter, and therefore India abstained from signing that final statement there. So I think it is important to understand how each of the stakeholders, including United States or China or India, are looking at it or engaging with this problem of Ukraine crisis. And one should really avoid bracketing in nations together, and therefore China's approach has been very distinctly different than India's approach, or likewise the American approach also has been very different compared to approach that other major powers had taken on the subject.
So, Professor Swaran Singh, thank you very much for pointing out, the intricacies of India's approach to Russia also, which, as you said, they contained a certain amount of changes throughout the recent months, including pointing out that aggression cannot be the answer to international conflicts. Thank you very much for joining us here on TVP World.